Welcome to this new edition of CIDOB's In Conversation With, which is a series of online conversations to discuss in depth current trends related to geopolitics, to politics, to international relations in a broad sense. Today we have the pleasure and the honor to have with us Cas Mudde, a Dutch political scientist, very well known, as you all know, for his work on political extremism and populism, particularly in Europe and the United States. But he has also done research on political parties, on extremism in general, on democracy, civil society, and European politics. At present, Cas Mudde is Professor of International Affairs at the University of Georgia in the United States, and also at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Cas, welcome, and thanks a lot for being here with us today. You have said several times that your presence is not good news. It means that the extreme right is becoming bigger and a much more central issue. And this is the case. The far right is rising worldwide and also in Europe. In 7 out of the 27 EU member states, the far right is the biggest party. In half of them, they are the second or third party. And in fact, they are involved in coalitions at the national or subnational level in more than half of the EU member states, which is a lot. In this context, and this is my first question, are all European far-right parties part of what you call the fourth wave? What do they have in common, and what are still the main differences among them?
Thanks for having me. The fourth wave, and in general, I would say the idea of the waves or perhaps phases is better, describes in part the relationship between, let's say, the far right in general and the political environment of it. And so when I speak about the fourth wave, I'm not necessarily speaking about a specific characteristic of the far right parties, but rather its relationship to the mainstream. And what characterizes the fourth wave is the mainstreaming and normalization of far-right ideas and far-right actors. Now, to be clear, that is not universal, not even in Europe or Western Europe. In a country like Denmark, for example, far-right ideas as well as far-right actors have been largely, if not completely, mainstreamed and normalized. This is very similar in countries like the Netherlands and increasingly in Sweden, but much less the case in Germany, for example, or in Belgium. And so in that sense, yes, there are differences. Those differences are not necessarily defined by the far right, but rather by the mainstream and how they treat the far right. Now, at a basic level, of course, these are all the same because they go in the same term, and at a very broad, in a very broad understanding, the far right refers to all political ideas and movements that, on the one hand, see differences within societies as natural and often also good, and that have problems with either democracy as popular sovereignty and majority rule, in that case we speak about extreme right, or with liberal democracy, where they do accept that people elect their own leaders, but they have problems with elements of liberal democracy, such as pluralism, minority rights, separation of powers, etc. Virtually all of the parties that we talk about are radical right in this, or pretend to be radical right, in the sense that they claim to support democracy. The problem today is that in action, some of these parties actually undermine democracy. Even the simple aspect of one person, one vote and majority rule. And one can think about the situation in Hungary, for example, where free and fair elections are have not been held pretty much now for 3 elections in a row. But you can also think about the Republican Party, which throughout the country is involved in voter suppression, voter intimidation. At the same time, both parties claim to be in favor of democracy and argue that their measures are actually to ensure that real democracy is being implemented. Now, for me, the core of the far right is nativism and authoritarianism. And nativism, very simply stated, is a xenophobic form of nationalism, where you want a monocultural state, and anything that is considered to be culturally different is seen as threatening. Virtually all of the parties that we call far right, that we think about Vox or Alternative for Germany, Sweden Democrats, for them, nativism is at the heart of the political message. This is also the case for Modi in India, for the far right in Israel, including Likud, or the far right here in the US, like the Republican Party. The centrality of nativism, however, is more problematic outside of, simply stated, outside of what you could say the global north. Most notably, within the context of Latin America, nativism is less central. And some scholars argue that actually people like Bolsonaro or Cas in Chile are not nativist. I think that's a strong statement, but you can definitely argue that nativism isn't as central. Similarly, there is a lot of division over positions on the economy. Overall, the vast majority of far-right parties are more right-wing, as in pro-capitalist. They generally have a problem with globalization, not so much because of the capitalism, but because the capitalism doesn't have any borders. And so they are more in favor of a type of national capitalism. But again, in Latin America, neoliberalism, at least rhetorically, is very important to people like Bolsonaro or to Cas, whereas neoliberalism is barely stated, although somewhat implemented by parties like Law and Justice in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary. And finally, populism is becoming, I think, a more divisive issue in the sense that populism is not as central, I think, as is always claimed. First of all, populism was always secondary to far-right parties. The main enemy is not the domestic or the ethnically similar elite. The main enemy is always the non-ethnic other, the immigrant or the minority. And the other thing is, as a consequence of the mainstreaming and normalization of the far right, particularly within broader right-wing circles, populism becomes less important. Like, think about Italy or Sweden or Denmark or the Netherlands, where far-right parties are now governing or trying to govern with mainstream right-wing parties. So why should they be against the right-wing elite when the right-wing elite embraces them?
Thank you very much. I'm trying now to move to the main topics mobilized or used by this extreme right. To what extent, or what are the main topics they mobilize, or that mobilize, let's say, the voters, the vote towards these extreme right parties? To what extent, as you have argued, is migration one of the issues or the issue behind the success of these extreme right parties? And what about gender issues, or let's say the backlash against feminism or climate change, or better said, the reaction to climate change mitigation measures? Maybe here there are some differences, right, as well, particularly focusing on the case of Europe.
Yeah, when you look at Europe, particularly Western Europe, then immigration has always been the most important element. And when we talk about immigration, we actually mean both immigration and integration. And that's important because, particularly in, I would say, the early 2000s, the first decade, for example, there was very little debate about immigration because there was very little immigration. Immigration came back on the agenda, particularly with the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16. Most of the debate in the wake of 9/11 was actually about integration, about what to do with the ethnic others, particularly Muslims, that were already in the European countries. And so that all goes back to the centrality of nativism. And so nativism is central. And now, as a consequence of the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, immigration has also become an issue in Central and Eastern Europe, where the numbers are much lower. But that crisis, of course, went through the Balkan Europe and made it an issue in countries like Hungary, but even in countries like Estonia, which barely have any immigrants. Now, immigration itself is a narrow issue, but you can link it to a vast majority of issues. And in the US, we call that the racialization of issues. And that means that you discuss an issue through the lens of racial differences, or in a European context, ethnic differences. And so one of the best examples is crime. Like, crime has always really been racialized, even before migration was really discussed. And so the crime that is committed, for example, by Muslims or people that we think are Muslims, is often seen as more organized, more political or religiously inspired than crimes committed by so-called natives. But increasingly, we see the racialization of other issues. For example, housing, as we saw in the Dutch elections recently, where the argument was that we have a housing crisis in the Netherlands because the asylum seekers get all the houses, which factually is not true, but makes it attractive to voters who primarily are concerned about immigration. Nativism is also linked, mostly implicitly, to patriarchy and to heteronormativity. And what I mean by that is that in the nativist vision, the nation constitutes of heteronormative families. So the core unit of the nation is families, and families means a father, a mother, and children. So that means that, for example, gender equality or gay rights are seen as threatening the foundation of the family and therefore the foundation of the nation. Because if we have fewer heterosexual families, we have fewer children, which means we have a problem for the nation to continue itself. If women are more interested in working and no longer want to have children, again, the nation will die. So in that sense, nativism can be linked to a very broad set of issues, ranging from housing to gay rights to even climate change, where we sometimes see that, again, in the Netherlands, but in other countries too, the idea is that climate change is not actually a big issue. It's mostly used to keep the power where it is, so for the established parties, and it is used as an excuse to create space for asylum seekers, for immigrants. So here in the Netherlands, we had a debate about nitrogen and that we should have fewer farms. And then the conspiracy theory was that this was really not about climate, but this was about creating housing for asylum seekers. So what I want to say by that is that far-right parties are not single-issue parties. they care about, because they're nativist and authoritarian, they care about what they consider to be the natural order, which is something that the right in all its permutations has in common. They believe that there is kind of an essentialist order which generally is constituted around the heteronormative family. And this also means that their opposition to, for example, gender equality or LGBTQI issues is something in which the far right has to compete with mainstream parties, where mainstream parties, for example, Christian parties, will oppose these issues with interpretations of Christian thinking, or conservative parties will just say, well, this is the order and that shouldn't be changed because then we get chaos. For the far right, in the end, everything is about the nation, and they oppose these things because it weakens the nation. Now, finally, there are some differences in the sense that most far-right parties adapt to the broadly shared views in society. And for example, on LGBTQI issues and on gender equality, Northern Europe is much more progressive than Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And as a consequence, we now have things like femo-nationalism or homo-nationalism. And what we mean by that is that far-right parties in the North will sometimes defend gender rights or even gay rights, not transgender rights, but gay rights, in the context exclusively of immigration and multiculturalism. And the argument goes like that. We don't support gender equality because we're feminists. We support gender equality because these are Dutch values. And they are threatened exclusively by Muslims, not by our own indigenous Bible Belt. No, that is ignored. So what we see is a femo-nationalist and homo-nationalist discourse in the North. But when push comes to shove, far-right parties barely ever vote in favor of gender equality or gay rights if it is not within the context of immigration. So they don't actually care about those values. They just use them in their struggle against what they see as Islamization. But this can only be applied in a country where gender equality and gay rights are supported by the vast majority of the people. And therefore, you don't see it in countries like Spain or Italy, let alone Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I was also asking this because we were also thinking about the case of Spain and Vox. No? In the case of Vox, migration, immigration, and integration issues are not yet the most central issue. It is an issue, and of course they talk about immigration and all the problems related supposedly to this immigration, but the main issues for Vox are basically gender issues and all territorial grievances, particularly between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, and particularly Madrid. So here we saw some differences, and I was wondering how you interpret it.
Well, I also, and I'm not an expert, but I also think that the lack of progress of Vox is partly linked to this. In the last election, they focused very strongly on culture war issues. And culture war issues just don't have the same resonance as nationalism issues. And so while Catalonia was something that they could really get off on, as well as immigration in certain southern parts, gender issues matter less to their voters as issues of national identity. On top of that, they have far more competition from the mainstream right there, particularly Partido Popular, which is also using a similar discourse, but addresses it more from a natural order argument, and that is more a conservative argument than a nationalist argument. So I think personally that as long as issues that are clearly linked to nativism national identity, as long as these issues are not central to the campaign of Vox and the national campaign of the country, Vox will kind of stagnate a bit.
That would be good news. Let's see what happens. I have another question. We often put the focus on the extreme right, also to explain the shift towards more extreme right positions by mainstream parties. But what is the responsibility of these mainstream parties and their policies, not only in fighting, but also particularly in preventing this shift towards the extreme right discourses? Should they overcome particular issues? Should they avoid ending up adopting the same stances? What is the solution? We have seen the cordon sanitaire is not a solution anymore. What could be then the alternative to prevent giving rise to this extreme right?
Yeah, I think that the responsibility for mainstream right parties partly overlaps with that of the mainstream left and partly doesn't. And so the first priority for any political party is to implement its policies. And so for the mainstream right, that means its first priority is to implement mainstream right-wing policies, which I believe should be within liberal democracy. And so as a consequence, mainstream right-wing parties should defend liberal democracy at all costs. That being said, they do have quite a lot in common, particularly on social cultural issues, with far-right parties. As a consequence, collaborating with the far right is much more natural for the mainstream right than it is, for example, for the mainstream left. Like, think about gender equality, think about gay rights, but also think about just the importance of national identity. So, in and by itself, it's not problematic that the mainstream right would govern with or make coalitions with the far right, as long as they do it on their own terms, which means staying exclusively within liberal democracy. I think the problem is that the mainstream right is increasingly copying the frames of the far right, in which, for example, immigration, in which Islam, in which transgender people, whatever, are seen as threatening to national identity and national security. This is a fundamentally anti-pluralist frame, which as a consequence is fundamentally opposed to liberal democracy, which is based on pluralism. Now, the problem is if you adopt the frames which many mainstream right parties have adopted purely opportunistically, they think these frames are popular among their voters or potential voters, and to a certain extent they're right. They don't necessarily believe in them at first, but they think that's the way to win the voters back. But they also think they can manage the issue. The problem is when you adopt that frame, inevitably you will have to adopt their policies. Like if you talk about immigration as a threat to national identity and as a threat to national security, you have to enforce pretty authoritarian border policies as well as surveillance policies in your country itself. And so what we actually see is that a lot of far-right policies are being implemented by mainstream parties, which initially only adopt the frames, but as a consequence of adopting those frames, also create expectations among their voters, and then they will give the policies that belong to those frames, which means far-right policies. And I think if you look at Frontex and borderline policies in the EU context, is a very good example. But so what should they do? I think all political parties including the mainstream right, should be proactive rather than reactive. For the past 2 decades, the political agenda has too much been set by the far right. And so it's the far right that decides what issue we talk about, but more importantly, how we talk about it. Those are the frames I spoke about earlier. If the mainstream right would set its own agenda, that doesn't mean that they don't talk about immigration, or they don't talk about crime, or they don't talk about, in the Spanish context, Catalonia. But they will talk about it from their own ideology, and there is the Achilles heel of contemporary politics. And that is that politics has become completely de-ideologized over the last decades. This started to a certain extent when the left embraced the market in the 1990s with so-called New Labour or the Third Way, and political parties became pretty much similar in terms of the economic policy. And now we see it increasingly with social cultural issues, where everyone kind of argues that immigration is a problem and should be managed. Most of the discourse also is pragmatic rather than ideological. The argument is not like, we want to create this type of world and therefore we're going to do this. No, the argument is, the world is like this, it's globalized, it's this, it's that. And so we have no other choice than to do this or to do that. And so you hear this very often, like, our economic policy has to be like this because we live in a globalized world, or our whatever policies have to be like this because we're a member of the EU. Now, even if there is some truth to that, it also is very disempowering. Like, what you're telling the voter really is, you can vote whatever you want, but it doesn't matter because everything is already decided. And that is what both populists in general and the far right do very well. They present an alternative, and they say, we can do this if we want to. And they also have a clear idea. They have a clear ideal society, which is monocultural, which has a traditional order where men have a leading role, women have a serving role, where straight people are the norm, etc., etc. And while they overstate the power that national politicians have these days, at the same time, I think that many mainstream parties undersell, because a lot of the choices that they make are still choices. They decide to stay in the EU. They decide to be part of the globalized economy. And there might be good reasons for that, but you have to explain to the people why you do this. And so rather than all the time saying, oh, I also understand that this is a problem, but we have no alternative, you say, look, yes, on this specific issue, the EU might not provide the best solution, but on all the other issues, we cannot deal with that without the EU, for example, right? So we have to re-ideologize. And what you see with social democracy, but also Christian democracy and also conservatism, is that there is virtually no ideology. There is no ideal society. There is no big program of how to achieve it. And that ideological vacuum is filled by the far right, which has an old school, perhaps overly simplistic, but clear and to a certain extent empowering ideal that offers hope to some people.
And now shifting to the EU level, and in relation to the next European Parliament elections, we may see then a major shift to the right, to the extent that the two far-right parliamentary groups could end up representing the second major force. So what could be then the consequences of this sharp right turn in terms of, for instance, EU enlargement, but also foreign policy with regard to the war in Ukraine, environmental issues, social issues, migration policies? Do you expect a major shift on all these areas?
So I think most depends on the group formation after the election, which is always the big problem with European elections. We focus a lot on like what parties are doing well, but particularly the far right is heavily divided. They're currently primarily in two different groups, Identity and Democracy, which is broadly accepted as a far right group, and then the European Conservatives and Reformists, the ECR, which is still wrongly perceived as a conservative group, even though 10 of the 17 members parties at the moment in the European Parliament are far right, which includes their two major factions, Law and Justice from Poland and the Brothers of Italy. That's, of course, also the group of Vox, which is clearly far right, and the Sweden Democrats, similar story. There, at the moment, it doesn't look like ECR and ID are going to merge. At the same time, we have Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party floating around. It's rumored that they're going to join ECR. If that is the case, that might actually also make ECR more attractive to A, some members of ID, and B, some East Central European parties that currently have problems with their own political grouping. I'm thinking about ANO of Babiš in the Czech Republic, which is in a very uncomfortable position in the Liberal Renew faction. I'm thinking about Smer of Robert Fico in Slovakia, which already for over a decade has a very problematic relationship with socialists and Democrats. I'm also thinking about Janša in SDS in Slovenia, which is still part of the EPP. Doesn't have much problems, but might think that a party, a grouping where Orbán and Meloni and Kaczynski are important people might be a better fit. So if the far right comes together, they will have about 25% of the vote, and they will be perhaps the second biggest faction. If that is the case, they will play a major role, mostly obstructive. I think that's not going to happen, though. I think there will probably be some changes, but we will probably have two groups, ECR and ID, which are both bigger than they are now, will collaborate, but will not be really setting the agenda. I think who is going to set the agenda is the right wing of the European People's Party, which includes, for example, Partido Popular, which has shifted vastly to the right over the last decades, which includes the Austrian People's Party, and some others, the Moderaterna in Sweden. The European People's Party used to be very much pro-Europe, pro-European integration, used to have a broad kind of from relatively progressive to or moderate centrist to relatively right-wing span. But particularly since Merkel is gone in the CDU and the CDU has moved to the right, the more centrist element of the EP is now really small and finds itself in parties like the Luxembourg Christian Democrats. In the next parliament, the current three centrist groups, the right-wing EPP, the center-left Socialists and Democrats, and the Liberal Renew Europe will still have a majority. But potentially, the right-wing coalition of EPP and the two far-right ID and ECR groups might also have a majority, which means that the right wing of the EPP sits in the driver's seat. And what I expect is that they are going to put pressure on S&D and Renew to accept more right-wing policies than they would want to. And the argument that they're going to use is, look, if you don't accept this policy, I will go to ECR and ID and get an even more right-wing policy. Now, where is this relevant? Mostly on immigration and on the European Green Deal. Like the EPP has made immigration and the European Green Deal pretty much the core issues of their campaign. And on both, they largely have adopted the framing of the ECR. So they're very skeptical about the Green Deal. They're pretty much like pulling a lot of the measures already back. Von der Leyen is actually doing this as part of her campaign for Spitzenkandidat. They're selling their immigration deal, first with Tunisia and now with Egypt. And so I expect a pretty sharp turn right on immigration, although let's face it, immigration policy has been already right-wing for a long time. It will be particularly negative in terms of environmental policy, which will be turned back. I also expect gender policies to be rolled back. I think broader social issues, generally, A, the right doesn't like them that much, and B, the far right in particular doesn't want the EU to govern on that and want the nation states to take care of that, in their view. I think the effect on foreign policy will be much less. And the reason is mostly because the bar is very low. For all the talk about the EU as a soft power, the soft power of the EU doesn't extend much further than its neighbors. The complete lack of importance of the EU is most visible currently in Gaza, where the EU is a non-actor because it's so divided. But the EU is a small actor in Africa. It's a small actor in the Pacific. It's a small actor in Latin America. That is not going to change much. I also don't think that Ukraine is going to change that much, because ECR parties are by and large fairly strongly pro-Ukraine. And there are few openly pro-Russia parties. I think Ukraine will generally suffer from so-called Ukraine fatigue, and just declining support for support for Ukraine among populations and broader politicians. I think the same kind of applies for enlargement. While many far-right parties are against enlargement, certain parties are in favor of it. One of the strongest supporters of enlargement towards the Western Balkans, for example, is Viktor Orbán, because he has a lot of friends there, most notably the current president and longtime president of Serbia. And he sees in them allies and potential veto players who can veto EU sanctions on Hungary. Anything that requires true proactive stances of the EU will suffer. And I'm thinking here particularly about defense. I mean, there is now somewhat of a discussion of creating a European defense, whether within NATO, within EU, or outside of it all. But it is clear that Europe has to increase its defense. And that requires collaboration, new collaboration. And of course, defense goes to the heart of statehood. And the far right will be very, very skeptical about that, as it will be pretty much very skeptical of almost everything transforming the EU, which is necessary if you're going to enlarge it. So I don't expect a real fundamental shift. I think that the EU will continue to muddle through as it has been doing for decades, but it will muddle through even less than it has done before.
Thanks. And now shifting to the US, you said that Europe's most important elections of the year will be in the US. In case Trump wins, what do you expect may be the main implications and consequences for Europe?
Yeah, well, when Trump wins, the key thing that's going to happen is that the US will withdraw from the world, in the sense that it will withdraw from playing an active collaborative role. Whenever Trump sees a US interest somewhere in the world, he will intervene. But Trump does not believe in multilateral organizations. He doesn't believe in the EU. He doesn't believe in the World Bank, in whatever climate accords. And of course, he doesn't believe in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And so one of the things that is going to happen is that the EU is going to be faced with what it has pretty much ignored since 1945, and that is that it has been living under the protection of the US, both during the Cold War and since then. Now, the EU could have prepared for that. After all, Trump has been absolutely clear about his dislike of the EU and his dislike of NATO from well before he became president in 2016. But the EU and European countries overall didn't do this. And then Joe Biden came to power, who was a really old school transatlanticist. And the urge was no longer felt. Now, let it be clear that Europe has to become more independent from the US anyway, because the Democratic Party is also moving away from Europe and is focusing more on the one hand, strategically, a struggle with China rather than Russia, and culturally, because the base of the Democratic Party is changing, it's focusing more on the global South, particularly Latin America. The difference is if Trump comes to power, Europe will be on its own within months, because everything that Trump does is radical. And so even while he might not get out of NATO, NATO will not be the same anymore. And it is unclear whether the US will actually come to the aid of NATO members should they be invaded by Russia. So what this requires is phenomenal EU action. It will have to, by and large, do the whole Ukraine support by itself, not just economically, but also militarily, on which it has failed massively. It doesn't have enough ammunition, doesn't have enough weapons, etc., etc. And it has to do that under more divided conditions than ever, with a very strong Eurosceptic bloc in the European Union. But it will also affect broader international politics. The EU has always been the biggest promoter of global human rights. But as an enforcer, it has always been very weak. After all, it depends on soft power, and soft power is mostly useful in the direct region. For however we dislike it, and however opportunistic and to a certain extent hypocritical the enforcement of global human rights has been by the US, it has been there. And for example, in Latin America, there's virtually no right-wing politician who entertains a problematic, illiberal move without first making sure that it could be accepted in Washington. If you have someone like Bolsonaro under Biden, he has to stay within certain boundaries. Those boundaries are gone as soon as Trump is there. Pretty much any dictator who says something nice about Trump will not feel the wrath of the US. And that means that the world's policeman, with all its problems, is gone. And we can criticize that, and I do that myself. But even in a disastrous situation as Gaza today, which looks as if it couldn't be worse, I'm pretty certain it would be worse under Trump, because Trump would either not care at all or just say, Israel, do what you want. So the EU will have to actually enforce all these policies it always claims purely by itself. And I think that is going to create massive stress within the European Union, because this costs a lot of money, this costs a lot of integration and shifting of national sovereignty. All of that is not popular, and generally the EU is very poor in its enforcement, because it's a very complex organization that takes forever to really get going.
Thank you, Cas. It's always very enlightening listening to you. At the beginning, I said, quoting you, that it's not good news having you. And indeed, you don't give us good news, but you give us the tools and the words to understand where we are, and from there to think other possible ways as well to challenge this sharp right turn, and other ways to think alternatives to what we are witnessing in Europe and also in the US and worldwide. So thank you very much, and hopefully we have you soon in Barcelona, and have the opportunity to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.